So welcome to Who Do You Call? Responding to Climate Disasters in Environmental Justice Communities. This webinar is the fifth in a series of webinars hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. The series is part of a Climate and Health Equity Fellowship, a program being conducted in cooperation with the National Medical Association's Southeast region to support the leadership of physicians of color in equitable climate change and health. This includes policy development, community education, and advocacy. I'm Dr. Mark Mitchell, the program director for the fellowship. Also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar is Dr. Kimberly Williams and our intern, Clarissa Payton. They will be available through the chat to answer any technical questions during the webinar. This series of webinars will be held for 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing. As you may know, lower resource communities, while on the front lines of disaster, often have less access to federal programs and may not be adequately served by local and state systems in place. Drawing from their decades of experience, today we will hear from two committed advocates who will discuss the emergency response system's failure to adequately support communities of color and outline policy solutions that can make the response more equitable. Our first presenter is Hilton Kelly, Executive Director and founder of Community Empower and Development Association, also known as CEDA. Hilton will share from his own personal experiences during the response following Hurricane Harvey, a threat exacerbated by the environmental challenges from existing refineries surrounding their community. Rather than using our time to provide further description of his extensive experience and information about the work he does, we're placing the link of his bio in the chat. Our second presenter is Jacqueline Patterson, who was most recently the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program on a national basis. Jackie is now at the Chisholm Legacy Project, which she founded earlier this month. The Chisholm Project is a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. You may also find a link to a more detailed description of her extensive environmental justice career in the chat. We appreciate their time and expertise in sharing with our community of climate and health advocates. So the general format for today's webinar will be a 20-minute presentation from each of our speakers, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers from you, our audience. We ask that you put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenters into the chat box at any time during this presentation. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A period. Please keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by background noise. And Hilton, you may begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you all for having me. I'm very, very honored to be speaking before you all today. As stated, my name is Hilton Kelly. I'm the founder and director of the Community Empower and Development Association located in Port Arthur, Texas on the Gulf Coast. Port Arthur, Texas is home to a number of oil refineries and chemical plants. Here in Port Arthur, we have the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, which is called Motiva. Motiva puts out 633,000 barrels of oil per day. Then we have
Hilton, do you want to tell us when you want to advance the slides?
Yes. Let's just go ahead and advance it now. That'll be fine. To the first slide. Port Arthur, Texas is home to as I stated, the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, which is Motiva. They put out 633,000 barrels of oil per day. Port Arthur, if you look at the map, we're located about 98 miles east of Houston, Texas, on the Gulf Coast. If you look at to the left of the state of Texas, you can see where Port Arthur is located. Down, you see Baytown there. And then if you go just a little bit more eastward from Baytown, Port Arthur sits right there on the Gulf. And so the Port Arthur Oil Refinery, we have the Total Oil Refinery, BASF Chemical, we have Oxbow Calcining Petroleum Coke Facility, we have the Valero Oil Refinery, Chevron Chemical, and Veolia Chemical Plant, and BASF Chemical. With all of these industries located in one area, there is a huge impact on the health and welfare of the citizens that live on the fence line and also in surrounding areas. Many of the people here in the city of Port Arthur suffer from respiratory issues due to the large amount of chemicals that we're being pre-exposed to. There's a large number of people with cancer. Port Arthur, Texas has the 10th largest cancer population throughout the whole state of Texas. Port Arthur, Texas also have a large number of people that are suffering from liver and kidney disease and that have to seek dialysis. And many times, because of the large number of people that are in a dialysis clinic, people are being given the tools to take home with them to clean their own blood at this particular point, because the system is just overburdened. Now, if we take a closer look at these industries and their weaknesses, when you think about hurricanes coming into the Gulf of Mexico and coming ashore, many times these industries, which you see there in the slide, the Total Oil Refinery is to the east of the west side of Port Arthur in the blue there. And if you look at the industries in yellow and in orange, that is on the west end of Port Arthur in the historic African-American community. And we sit right up against those industries. And matter of fact, we sit right in that little cat-a-corner community. And each year, these plants have to go into shutdown mode numerous times. Whenever a refinery or chemical plant go into a startup or a shutdown mode, what you'll find is that there's a lot of soot, smoke, and toxic fumes that sort of come from the stacks and light over the community. Now, we have done many studies to get a good grip as to how these chemicals are impacting us. We know that benzene is a known carcinogen. Benzene impacts the human body. It impacts the respiratory system. It's a cardiovascular, it creates cardiovascular issues as well, gastrointestinal issues, liver and kidney disease issues, and what have you. Benzene is another known carcinogen. Propylene, we're also being exposed to other chemicals such as sulfur dioxide and other toxins that are used in this industry, like ethylene, propylene, sulfuric acid, styrene, hexene, toluene, ammonia, methanol, chlorine. All these chemicals accumulate together in the air. We have yet to understand exactly how they impact our body because the Environmental Protection Agency have yet to do a cumulative impact study in our area. Back in 2003, Dr. Marvin Legator with the University of Texas Medical Branch came to Port Arthur and he did a symptom survey. And he took 100 folks from Port Arthur, 100 folks from Beaumont, which is to the north of Port Arthur, Texas, about 13 miles away. And then they used 100 folks from Galveston. Now, the two things that we had in common were industries that are dumping tons of toxins. With Beaumont and Port Arthur had that same common denominator, but Galveston had the same social and economic issues as Port Arthur and Beaumont, but yet they had no industries. And at the end of Dr. Marvin Legator's study, they found that it was a direct correlation between the illnesses that we were displaying in Port Arthur and Beaumont and the types of chemical we were being exposed to. But because of the unprecedented number of hurricanes that have been coming ashore, we believe due to climate change, Those issues and impacts from those industries have been further exacerbated because now they're having more and more shutdown issues. And whenever they go into shutdown mode, they have to burn the product that's in the pipeline. So they send it to the flares and they burn it. And once they burn it without any type of filter or any type of scrubbers, well, we're being directly impacted by pure benzene, by 1,3-butadiene, and also by particulate matter, 2.5 microns. And when you breathe in this dust material and that's latent with all these toxins, well, of course, it's going directly into your bloodstream from your lungs. So therefore, hurricanes and climate change is all mixed together, helping to exacerbate our problem. Climate change is a major component as to why we're seeing the disproportionate number of hurricanes that are coming ashore. Climate change is also feeding into the heat waves that we're dealing with. And so the number of health issues that we're seeing in Port Arthur is unlike what we've ever seen before. We have a large number of people that have died from cancer, suffering from cancer at this present time. As a matter of fact, I lost my dear friend, whom you all don't know, by the name of Eddie Brown. He passed away just this March from cancer. He had suffered for like 6 years from pancreatic cancer. And I have several other classmates that have died from cancer. They all came out of the class of 1978. And prior to our class, we've seen a large number of people dying from the class of 77. It's disproportionate, I think, to any other community in the state of Texas because of the large amount of industries we have here. We believe this is why so many people are succumbing to cancer. And whenever they have to go into shutdown mode due to these hurricanes that have been plaguing the Gulf Coast for many, many years now, well, this is what happens. I mean, so therefore, climate change is a real issue. We're seeing the change on the Gulf. We're seeing sea level rise. There was a beach that is just south of Port Arthur, Texas, that is called McFadden Beach. McFadden Beach, back in the 1960s, the surf would set back away from the beach, maybe about a good 50 yards, 60 yards. Now, the surf has come up, taken over the beach, and now the road, I think it's Highway 87 that we would periodically take to the beach, the road is washed out in key areas. So we have to go 30 miles now out of the way just to go to the beach, and we go through Winnie, which is north of Port Arthur. Then we drop down and go back down south. And so it's a 30-mile ride now because of the sea level rise. Many people do not believe that sea level rise is happening because of climate change, but yet we know for a fact in Port Arthur that it is. But one of the questions I like to ask is, how did we get here? Now, many people that live in low-lying areas, due to Jim Crow back in the 1930s and 40s, we were put there. We were put in those low-lying areas due to discriminatory practices and systemic racism within our federal and state system. And because of those discriminatory practices, many people that live in low-lying areas are still there today because the land that was passed on to them generation after generation, well, that's all they have up until this day. So we've heard language where people speak of, why are they still living there? Why don't they just leave? Why should we have to flip the bill to get people out of that particular area or those areas in between Mississippi, Louisiana, all the way into Texas? Historically, we were placed there and we were forced to live there by federal government and our state governments. And we feel that it's important for those entities to come together to find a way to assist people with remaining in those areas if they choose to, or relocating or retreat. Because at this particular point, before we change this paradigm with climate change, I think the water levels are going to become higher, and I think the impacts from industries are going to be worse. People that are impacted by these hurricanes is just not the wind and the rain that we are dealing with here, because the wind and the rain is what bring in the water. Once the water comes in, homes are damaged. When those homes are damaged, what does the damage look like? There are holes in the roof. The water rains in to the home. Now, before FEMA can even react, the homes are starting to mildew. FEMA has a very, very slow response. when it comes to attending to flood issues. We're finding that sometimes your home will sit in the water maybe 2 or 3 months before FEMA even comes out with their team. I don't know if FEMA is overstressed with disaster issues, natural disasters, but this is an ongoing thing every year for the last, since 2005, when Port Arthur was hit by Hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Rita. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. A lot of New Orleans people fled eastward or westward into Texas, and a lot of them landed here in Port Arthur. About a month or so after those Katrina people came here for refuge, then we got hit by Hurricane Rita. And it seems like every year after that, hurricanes have been more and more prevalent, and they're getting more and more stronger. As you can see in the picture there, this is not uncommon in the city of Port Arthur now to have flood waters 3 to 4 feet high in the streets to where many cars are stalled out. So with that being said, we need to find ways in which we can assist people living in low-lying areas due to no fault of their own. So what we've started to look at is ways we can build sustainably. We can go to the next slide. Oh yes, and let's talk about the unprecedented snowstorms as well and ice freezes. Just this picture was taken, what was it? I think right in March. Yes, no, it was February the 15th. We had a cold snap here in the city of Port Arthur, which is unheard of. We never have snow in the Port Arthur area or in Southeast Texas, period. But yet this cold snap led to power failure, and that power failure led to a lot of people losing their lives due to freezing to death. Unfortunately, many people lost power and they were fully electric. This is one reason why we feel that many people should have alternatives when it comes to energy sources, because when this cold snap happened, many people in the city of Port Arthur were not prepared, and also people need to be made aware on how to use generators. We lost a whole family because they weren't aware of the fact that they should not have put their generator within the compounds of their home. So we could go to the next slide. What you see here is a home that is covered with a blue tarp. We call this a FEMA blue tarp. This is what they come in and put on your roof because they just don't have the funding or the resources to adequately support the homeowners with repairing their roof in a timely fashion. And these blue tarps do not keep all of the water out of your home. But meanwhile, people still need a place to live. So therefore, many people stay in these homes with these blue roofs, leaky roofs. Mold is building up in the homes, particularly in the warm weather. And when you have mold spores in the air floating around and you're breathing it on a daily basis, kids are susceptible to those mold spores. They develop respiratory issues, they develop asthma, and also you develop skin disorders as well, because in many homes, you find people have this dry, itchy skin patches all over their arms and shoulders. And so this is why it's so important that the Federal Emergency Management Agency do something to get their act together where they can respond in a more efficient manner. Because of FEMA's slow response, many people suffer in the sweltering heat and they die. They are literally dying because of lack of support. And also what we find is that there's an unequal equity when it comes to distributing money to support people with rebuilding. Can we go to the next slide? Now, what you see here is a sustainable way of building. Now, this is something that everyone should be embarking on in the city of Port Arthur and surrounding areas that deal with chronic flooding. And now that we know that climate change is real and we're flooding every year, we're seeing 3 and 4 hurricanes a year that come ashore. And we're not going to speak of the ones that come into the Gulf and just sit and we wonder whether or not it's going to make it ashore. But we could almost guarantee now that at least 2 or 3 hurricanes are coming ashore a year. Just last year, we had Hurricane Laura come ashore. Hurricane Laura basically was dead set for coming to Port Arthur, but it sort of veered to the left of us, and it ended up hitting Lake Charles, Louisiana, and devastated Lake Charles. People are still living in squalor because their homes are still destroyed. They have pots and pans all over the porch. respiratory issues at an all-time high, and people are dying because they do not have a clean, healthy environment to live in, particularly our elderly folks. Our elderly are suffering the worst because they just cannot withstand these climate issues year after year after year, not to mention the costs of having to rebuild your home or to re-roof your home on a yearly basis. So I believe it's important for the Biden administration to come up with a plan in which we can help these citizens that have to bear this burden every year. With that, I'll stop and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Hilton. We really appreciate those very interesting discussion of what happens during an emergency and during what happened in Port Arthur, Texas. So next we will turn it over to Jackie Patterson. So go ahead and begin, Jackie.
Thank you so much. So it's an honor to be here with you all. It's an honor to follow Hilton as always. And yeah, looking forward to just sharing a little bit with you here. So I'm gonna share my slides. Make sure we have them. All right, hold on. So I'll be just talking a little bit from a national perspective about some of what we've seen and some of the ways that we have taken action. As Dr. Mitchell said, I am in transition from being the Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP, and now moving into founding and directing the Chisholm Legacy Project. So I'll be doing a lot of the same work that I was doing at the NAACP at the Chisholm Legacy Project, which will really be focusing on supporting frontline community leadership around issues of environmental and climate justice, many of the issues that Hilton was describing. This is a toolkit that we put together at the NAACP, In the Eye of the Storm, People's Guide to Transforming Crisis and Advancing Equity in the Disaster Continuum, meaning from preparedness to recovery and redevelopment and onwards. So I wanted to actually start us off with the words and the action of this couple that was kind of telling their own story of the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in their community. So I'm going to slide out of this. Let's see, where's the actual link? Oh, there it is. So I'm going to stop sharing and then share again so you can see this at the same time.
My name is Scott Michael Roberts.
Sorry, one second. So never as smooth as you would like. Oh, okay, that's right. I minimized. Maximize again. And we'll stop share. Hold on. Sorry, that did not go as smooth as I would like. Okay. I promise the next one will go better. Promises. Hold on. Oh, okay, no wonder. So this video was actually shot by, it was kind of shot on the phone.
Hi, my name's Sahar and I'm the founder of Less Brands. Oops. And we make products for curly hair that actually work.
Okay, skip ad. Yeah, so they shot this amateur on their phones, and so once again, I'm so sorry. This is not. Somehow stopped the video that I was trying to show you. Let me go back and find it.
Dr. Patterson,
yeah.
If you want, I think I have the video pulled up. If you want me to share my screen real quickly.
No, I've got it now. I'm sorry.
People up at the shelter because we were taken in by her uncle in Alexandria, Louisiana, and we were just riding back to the shelter.
Take it back to the beginning.
My name is Scott Michael Roberts. This is my wife, Kimberly Roberts. We're from New Orleans, the ninth ward, underwater. Move that is like aiming toward Mississippi, so we might get the outskirts.
At the sky, it look pretty nice. It sure soon will change.
What happened was we had dropped people off at the shelter because we were taken in by her uncle in Alexandria, Louisiana, and we were just riding back to the shelter to see what we could do, see if we could catch up with any of our family members who we didn't know where they were or where they were going or if they were alive. So I seen them with cameras and they looked real professional, you know. It looked like a movie camera deal going down. I told my wife, I said, that's the people we need to talk to about getting the tape to, you know, to let them see it so we could get us some money. We lost everything, so basically our plan was to try to get money.
Yeah, you know, I just happened to buy that camera from this guy I knew for $20 a couple of weeks before the storm, and my plan was just to buy the camera to learn how to work it, and then so I could record family events and you know things like that. Never thought I'd be.
Anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you a sense, mostly because of this notion of us being able to tell our own stories. Too often someone else is telling our stories, and as opposed to us telling our own stories. And so I wanted to really give a sense of what it looks like for us to tell our own stories, our own narratives. And so I would have shown you more of that, but I only have so many minutes for this presentation, so I want to make sure we're getting through the whole thing. So when we talk about kind of the challenges that we face, and Hilton has already given us a good sense of the realities and the underpinnings that we often talk about as a historical context, which is this nation being founded on the extraction and exploitation of humans and natural resources, whether it is the displacement and the stealing of the land of the original inhabitants, or it is going over to sub-Saharan Africa and stealing people and enslaving people and putting them in the holds of ships as cargo to then become the enslaved labor that built so much of the infrastructure of this country. And then we see this going forward in the ways that we are recklessly extracting natural resources, and Hilton has already given us a sense of some of the perils of that and which communities are on the front lines of those impacts. And then we have all of this institutionalized within the trade, manufacturing, finance, labor, and even disaster management policies, and who they benefit and who they don't benefit. And so when we start to do this work and seeing the intersection between disasters and environmental and climate justice, we looked at all the different disasters, the ones that are so many of what we're calling natural disasters now are unnatural because them being driven by human action that has caused the proliferation of climate change. So whether it's the earthquakes or the tornadoes or the winter storms, or the landslides and droughts, and we see even how they're making a tie between the building collapse in Florida because of the sea level rise that's affecting the limestone underneath underneath the surface there in Florida, and they're attributing some of that erosion in terms of the sinkholes that are proliferating in Florida. And so we're just seeing more and more of these types of disasters. And of course, on the front lines are our communities who are often most impacted. So the disasters themselves don't discriminate, but those pre-existing vulnerabilities of where our communities are located, we're more likely to be located in floodplains, the types of housing stock we have. We tend to have the more compromised housing stock as BIPOC communities. And then, as Hilton said, the actual relief and recovery efforts are often not necessarily putting the communities that are most impacted, the most vulnerable, at the foreground of the services that are being provided in the way that the system is set up. And so whether it's all of those things, and also on top of it all, the fact that we tend to be less likely to be insured, whether it's general homeowners insurance, and certainly the flood insurance clause that people only discover even exists or doesn't exist in one's policy when we're in the middle of a flood. So, and then when you intersect the fact that these toxic facilities like the refineries that Hilton described and so forth are disproportionately located in our communities, then when flooding happens or these other types of disasters, then those very toxic facilities that can then become instruments of greater harm for our communities, whether it's the nuclear reactor pictured here, which when the flooding and tornadoes of 2011, exactly 10 years ago, they when the flooding and the tornadoes came through this nuclear reactor, Grand Gulf Nuclear Station in Port Gibson, Mississippi, there was a concern there about whether that was going to end, that reactor was going to end up being breached. And it was right in the middle of a lower income, primarily African-American community. And when we went there, we found that the Red Cross only had, like, where all the other communities we had visited across the region, they had a full-fledged disaster recovery center, like in a community center or in a gymnasium at a school. But here, instead of a full-fledged disaster recovery center, even though so many of the residents were displaced by the disaster, they only had like a card table and like 2 Red Cross representatives in front of City Hall. So we asked them why they didn't have a full-fledged DRC. And they said, well, we have a rule at the Red Cross where we don't establish, these, and we also found out that they didn't provide resources for sheltering for a church that was ready to shelter for all the people that were displaced. And all of that was tied to the fact that Red Cross doesn't set up full operations and doesn't finance operations within 7 miles of a nuclear reactor. And so even though people were allowed to live there and be in harm's way, even the folks who are charged with providing services have rules against putting their workers in harm's way. So that's nothing against the Red Cross, but that says that we need better zoning laws, better regulation about the proximity of people to these types of facilities. And so we saw how this played out in terms of Hurricane Katrina, in terms of the vast majority of the people who died were because they couldn't get out for various reasons, and too many African American. And so then on top of it all, we had folks who had further vulnerabilities, people in prison where they were literally abandoned by the guards and just left locked up for days without food, without water, as the sewage tainted floodwaters rose up and they had to dig through the walls just to get ventilation. And then we also look at the intersection with gender justice, where there were stories about not stories as if it was just kind of a meme, but actually incidents of people being raped after Hurricane Katrina. Same with the BP oil drilling disaster, where there was a spike in domestic violence against women. Whether it's the earthquake in Gujarat, the tsunami, the earthquake in Haiti, or these different things, consistently in all of these instances, violence against women, sexual violence, and other types of violence spikes after disasters. And this is another issue that we hardly ever hear talked about at all, much less do we have systems in place to deal with this known pattern of disproportionate impact. So exacerbating all of this is the fact that the seas are rising. So we talked about the collapse in Miami, but also it means that the storm surge is greater. So the superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, all of that is exacerbated by the fact that the seas are rising. And so one of the NOAA officials said that today's flood is going to be equal to tomorrow's high tide. So it's something that's normal as high tide. That's how normal flooding is already becoming and will be even more so, as Hilton talked about. Speaking of, when we were dealing after Hurricane Harvey, I was in conversation with Hilton constantly, and he connected me with someone when I was going through afterwards to try to work with the NAACP on what their response was going to be. And the person he connected me to, we were standing out in front of her home, and she made the statement, "We were never meant to be here. That refinery should not be here. My house should not be here. Mother Earth is mad and she has come to take her land back." And that really just struck me in that moment, her observation. And so I talked more about the inequities in response, the placement of the disaster recovery centers, the fact that prisoners are being used to do everything from fight forest fires to clean up hazardous materials without the proper protections. And we know also that with the situation with the forest fires, that it's they call it slave labor because of the amount that it's a part of the whole prison industrial complex, and why it's lucrative to have people in prison because of the amount that these contractors get to be a part of the fighting of forest fires. But yet the prisoners are getting $1 an hour at best, and then claiming that it's for their well-being because they can have these jobs afterwards. But one of the situations that I was in where there were prisoners being used to develop solar panels, and the company gave that rationale that, oh, well, they'll be able to get jobs in solar after they come out. Then that very company that was paying the contractor to use slave labor to create those solar panels, they had a rule against hiring formerly incarcerated persons at the biggest solar company at that time. And so again, people use rationale, but it really comes down to, once again, profits before people, and the enslavement of Black people. So when we talk about, and then, we know the forces that tend to be behind these things, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is, has membership from big pharma to certainly big oil and big coal, where they pay into these organizations that then create the legislation that allows for this kind of thing. We were looking at some of the county records in one place where prison labor was just listed as a commodity, like, just like alongside, tractor trailers or whatever. It was just literally like listed as a number on a spreadsheet. People who are being put in harm's way without the proper training, without the proper gear to do what they're often being kind of pressured into doing. And so we talk about the aftermath and disaster. Also, I was struck when I was in Alabama, when I saw the people being fed in this kind of gymnasium, and it struck me. And I took this picture because literally every last person who was receiving food was African American, and every last person who was serving the food was white American. And it just struck me in terms of what did this mean? Who was most impacted? Who wasn't impacted at all? Who was able to bounce back quickly if they were impacted? And who was in this kind of need for food, need for services? Because when I went outside, it was the same situation. The people on the stage from local government, FEMA, the Red Cross, all of those people, down to a person, was white and mostly male, and then lined up at the mic, the people who needed information, who needed resources, who needed services. At this moment, when I took a picture, every last person was African American and all women. So again, who's in power, who's not, who needs, who's holding the resources, who's holding the reins. And so also, when I was some years, in 2016, when Hurricane Isaac came through, I was in Louisiana, and Plaquemines Parish was impacted by Hurricane Isaac severely, like a lot of property loss and so forth. And they asked Senator Mary Landrieu why it is that the levees hadn't been fortified, because it had been, how many years? 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, and all those levees were reinforced, but that levee hadn't been reinforced. And so she said she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question, and they said they use a formula to decide which levees would be prioritized for reinforcement. And the formula applied points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if that levee was overtaken. So it literally legislates, again, the devaluing of people who have like the lowest property values, because the highest property values are going to be protected in that scenario with that formula, and the people with the lowest property values, the people who are the most vulnerable, are going to be the least protected. And it brought to mind Dr. Robert Bullard's one of his titles for one of his books, The Wrong Complexion for Protection. And that's exactly what happens in the institute. And this also brings to mind the book that was written some years ago called Weapons of Math Destruction, where math and these formulas are literally legislating and legitimizing inequities and deepening inequities. And so again, when we go back to this narrative, this was an image that was taken on the same day after, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, same two activities, but described in a different way. When it was the two white people, it says 2 residents waded through chest-deep floodwaters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. But when it was an African-American young man pictured, it says a young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And so again, they're doing the exact same thing, but the white people are just, you know, people trying to survive, getting by, doing what they need to do to survive. When it's a black male, he's an unlawful thief who's looting and up to no good. And so this is where we see this kind of characterization in terms of criminalization. And this is where we see leading to the shots on the Danziger Bridge that resulted in the death of these families who were, again, just coming to find food, just coming to find their families back in the town, but somebody called the police on them saying that they were looters. And so these unarmed people were shot on the Danziger Bridge as a result of just being Black and being and trying to survive. So again, racial profiling, it's you know, people are profiled, they're criminalized, and they're tried and convicted and murdered all in a matter of moments in this situation. And so when we talk about kind of the legislation, there's a quote from Martin Luther King where he says, judicial decrees cannot create heart, they can only restrain the heartless. And this image is from this family in Alabama. Their trailer home was on this site here. And when the tornadoes were coming, they heard the tornadoes were coming, so they went next door to this church and said, because they had seen a lot of people going into the church, bringing belongings, and families were going in there. And they went in there, they're like, the tornado's coming, can we shelter here? And the church said that they weren't providing shelter and turned them away, even though they had seen many people going in there, all white people, and this family happened to be African-American. So they went back to the trailer, and long story short, only one person survived after the tornado took up their trailer and cast them out into the street. Only one person survived. And so again, where there's the advocacy that we must do, but there's also the heart that we need to be exploring in terms of why it is that these kind of things are allowed to happen. And so whether it's the United States or the Caribbean, we have communities and countries that are most impacted and that are most vulnerable. And so again, Black and Brown nations, just like Black and Brown communities in the global South, are most heavily impacted. We know that in Barbuda, that for the first time in its 300 years of existence, it did not have one single inhabitant after Hurricane Maria came and wreaked havoc there, so that literally there was not one standing inhabitable property there. And so when we as the United States, being 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, when we create the circumstances that are driving people from their communities, that are driving people from their countries, then we have in the past kind of cast people as interlopers who are coming to take from us, when in fact we should be thinking of ourselves as opening sanctuary, and at the very least taking responsibility for the fact that we're the ones that are driving them from their lands. Instead, we put people in cages and cast them as illegal, as outlaws, when really they're just trying to survive. This is a quote from a poem from Warshan Sanchere, a Kenyan-born Somali poet. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And so when we talk about solutions, you know, we do this climate action plans or eco districts or all these different things. But if it's not led by the communities for the communities, then we see displacement, and we see kind of what's supposed to have good intentions actually resulting in a displacement of our communities. And so we have people, you know, even in our own nation being called climate refugees when they're being displaced by these processes. And so, and speaking of the system, again, going back to Hilton's comment about FEMA, this is a community called Sand Branch, Texas, which is right outside of Dallas, which is one of the richest cities in our nation. And they have, it's a freedmen settlement. It was founded by formerly enslaved persons, and they have never had running water since the community was founded in 1865 or so. And so the community not only has never had running water in the past, but when they did have even well water, it was contaminated in the 80s. And since then, they've just been relying on these donations of bottled water that come every Saturday. But what's really that's injustice enough. But what happened is that FEMA was called in by the local authorities. Usually when FEMA declares something a floodplain, when they even do that assessment in the first place, is because the local authorities have called them in to make that assessment. And so they did that in Sand Branch. They declared these areas to be a floodplain, and that just made it justification for the county to not provide services for that community. So not only do they not have running water, but they don't have trash pickup. So those bottles of water that get delivered every Saturday end up in a trash bin and burned, emitting untold toxins into the community. And they're not allowed to make certain improvements on their houses because of this floodplain declaration. And so, but at the same time, when the buyout program started to being implemented, then people were already kind of being driven out by not having water, not having trash pickup, not having just basic services. And then when the flood declaration was given, the buyout program offered checks that were based on the value of the property that was assessed minus the amount of money it would take for them to demolish the structures that were on the property that people had to pay for in order to sell the home. And so they were given checks for $350 for these homes that have been in their family for generations since the emancipated enslaved persons settled in that community. And again, just that kind of collusion for land theft is again at the very center of why the system is not, it's not that the system is broken, it's doing exactly what it intended to do, which is to continue to keep certain communities oppressed. And then it's actually abetted by our very federal government in this process. And so once these communities, once their properties are sold for $350, we went back later and then assessed the value of those properties, and the values of those properties have quadrupled since that, at least. And so that is, that really kind of provides proof that there's something else amiss there, because that community is literally walking distance from another community where they have gates that open automatically, winding driveways, as we have a feeling that there's a developer waiting to develop that land once they can get that community out of there. And so we know the system.
So, Jackie, can you wrap it up, please?
Oh, sure. So we know the system that's fueling these inequities, you know, the different monies that are going into it, the stomping on our democracies. The video I would have shown you, but I won't. But as we advance just transition, we're moving away from an extractive economy to a living economy. And so these are just, you'll have a copy of this, of the PDF of this, but it includes all of the different ways that people are taking action, the types of steps that people are taking, the types of policies that we're putting forward, the processes that people are making to come up with these ideas in terms of community collective actions around this, and the different levers that people are pulling, whether it's zoning policies, federal legislation, regulations, and so forth. So that's all there for you to see. Another great video I definitely encourage you to look at, where it's a spoken word, really kind of talking about the very things that I just talked about. And really the ways that people are powering the types of solutions that we want, including really returning us to our democracy. And this is one of the communities that have gotten together, and that whole state of Florida came together, and they got all the folks certified in FEMA, so they can then go in and overturn the tables of the money changers in terms of the FEMA system. So this is another poem that I would have shown you, but I highly encourage you to take a look at that. And this is just my contact information going forward, and contact information for the NAACP as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You always have such great material and so much to present. So I do encourage people to go back and to review the slides and some of the resources that we will have available that you've provided. And so, so thanks so much, Jackie and Hilton, for your enlightening presentations. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions and answers. Even though I know that we could go on for much longer, so I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this month's webinar. And I hope that you all found it useful. But before we end, I'd like to alert you to an opportunity that's available right now from FEMA. There's an open comment period on climate change and underserved populations. And so they're seeking feedback until July 21st. And so we will add the link to the chat now. We'll also take your questions and see and present them to our speakers and see if there's an opportunity for them to answer some of the questions and put as many as we can on the website for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. Next month's webinar will be on August 13th, and it'll be on mental health. And so I encourage you to register and attend if you are able. We'll send a follow-up email after this webinar with a list of recommended readings on the topics of extreme weather and emergency response systems. But before you leave, we please ask that you take a moment to fill out our webinar survey. The link to the survey can now be found in the chat. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous support of our climate and health equity program and of this webinar. So this now concludes this session. And so have a wonderful day. And I'm hoping that our speakers can join the fellows for 15 minutes after this session.
Thanks for having us.
So thank you.